Hey, welcome to another edition of Rooted Digging In. My name is Daniel Norton. I'm the Senior Technical and R&D Manager for Horticulture. And today's episode, we're going to be discussing, is your growing mix physically fit? So we're going to be discussing all about physical properties, what does physical properties mean, and how to make the right mix for your growing needs. So, we're in the middle of mum season right now, and these are some chrysanthemum rooted cuttings that were planted at one of our customers. This particular customer was growing in a 60% peat, 40% Hydra Fiber blend. When I happened to be visiting this customer in question, these rooted cuttings had been planted for less than a week when I shot this image. And I just wanted to show it to you because even though it's fairly early on in production, one of the things that I love about this is if we pull up the root shot from this, from one of these plants, is we can actually start to see the roots reach the outside of the container. And again, this is about a little less than a week after planting. And so this is an excellent sign. And one of the things that we all love seeing when we look at our roots and our pots is these nice white, healthy looking roots. And this is a good indication that you have excellent physical properties in the substrate. And what do we mean by physical properties? Well, we're really talking about the water to air relationship in your substrate. And when we want good water holding capacity because it helps with the shelf life. It also helps to make sure that the plants have an adequate reservoir for their growing needs. But equally as important is the amount of oxygen to the root zone because roots thrive in oxygen. They need it for their biological processes. And there's a high correlation between rooting performance and oxygenation to the root zone. And so that's why it's extremely important. And here's another shot from the field. Now, unfortunately, this isn't of chrysanthemums. This is an image of some calibrachoa that I had shot during one of my grower visits. This was a grower that was experiencing an issue with their growing media. And one of the things I want to point out here is that we see some nice white healthy roots, but then we see some of these remnants of roots. They're very thin, almost look like tiny hairs. And initially when I first went to the customer, I thought, well, this is kind of one of the telltale signs of Pythium, where you have kind of the inner core that's left, whereas the sheath has been removed. But one of the things I thought was really odd was that most of these roots look nice and white and healthy. And we did some pathology testing, and we found out that there was actually no sign of Pythium in this particular plant. And so we came to the conclusion that what we had here was a mix that was not physically fit. This particular mix had way too much water holding capacity and not enough airspace. And so what was happening is these roots were dying, and we were getting probably some sort of saprophytic mold that was feeding on these roots early on. And the grower actually had reduced their water frequency, which is why we have these nice healthy roots here. So this was an indication of too much water holding capacity. And after our investigation, we found that their mixing equipment was set up to add too much peat moss to their mix. So their Hydra Fiber machine was dosing the right amount of Hydra Fiber, but however, their peat bale shaver and their hoppers was dosing too much peat into the mixing line, which was artificially raising their water holding capacity much higher than what they thought. And so we went back and recalibrated their equipment, and we corrected that problem for them. But regardless, the point is that this is the kind of issue that you can run into if you don't have the right physical properties. And so let's look at what are physical properties. And I mentioned on the very first slide that we're talking about water and air relationships, but from a more specific or more technical standpoint, these are some definitions that were created by North Carolina State University from their NCSU Parameter Handbook. This is a test that's widely used in the United States by independent labs as well as universities to determine physical properties. And the first definition we want to discuss is bulk density. So for those of you who have had soil science, Bulk density is simply the ratio of solids to volume in the substrate. So typically we more simply say weight per volume. And so in the United States, we typically refer to pounds per cubic foot. So different raw materials have different weights per volume. And so that's all that that means. Total porosity, or abbreviated TP, is the percent volume of substrate or component which is comprised of pores or holes. Now, the word total porosity is oftentimes highly confused by growers, and because the word porosity makes you think of air. And really all we're talking about in this example, or in this term, is pores. Those pores are there in the substrate, and those pores could be either water or air filled, but regardless, they're still pores. So that's what we're talking about as it relates to total porosity. Airspace now is, or AS, is the percent of the total porosity that of the substrate that is air filled. Okay, and this is at saturated or container, or excuse me, at field capacity or container capacity. So this would be like if you had a pot in your greenhouse, you recently watered it in, you waited for all the water to drain out of the bottom of the pot. It would be that amount of water that's being held against gravity after watering it in. So that would be the percentage of pores that are filled with air after you recently watered it in. And then lastly, we have a term that's called container capacity, or CC. This is kind of a play off the word field capacity, which I had used a moment ago. Field capacity is, the term that we use for water holding capacity in field soils. But since we're talking about soilless substrates and we're using them in containers, that's how that term has been adopted to be container capacity. And so in this particular term, that is the percent volume of the substrate or component that's filled with water. So that would be the portion of the total porosity, or the percent of the total porosity that is water filled, again, at saturation. So the more simple way of thinking about this is really a mathematical equation, which is TP equals airspace plus container capacity. So again, TP being the total pores, then the airspace, it being the air-filled pores, and then container capacity being the water-filled pores. And so that's the relationship between those terms that we need to know. So let's talk a little bit more about physical properties. So the selection of raw materials that you use in your substrate is extremely critical for the overall physical properties of the substrate. And on the left-hand side of the slide is a table, and we've got 6 different raw materials that I've in a general sense, organized from extremely wet at the very top to very dry at the bottom. And so you can see in general, core, peat, and vermiculite tend to be more wet raw materials, so they have a lot more water holding capacity than they have airspace. And generally, that's how they're utilized in the substrate. Whereas these 3 raw materials, Hydra Fiber, bark, and perlite, tend to be more used as aggregates to add airspace to the substrate. As you can imagine, components and substrates vary in quality. So in other words, these are general reference points for you. So for example, most core pith is going to have a lot of water holding capacity, but it's also possible that you could have a different grade or quality of core, which may be on the more drier end of things. Peat moss, especially fraction peat, which is commonly used in Europe, can also be very dry if you have like a 20 to 40 millimeter peat. And then Hydra Fiber, as you know, from some of our other talks that we've done, there's 5 different grades of Hydra Fiber Ultra. So we have a very, very dry Hydra Fiber, like Hydra Fiber 510, which is used to maximize airspace. And then we have Hydra Fiber 065, which is got the most water holding capacity. But also these raw materials are going to vary in quality. So for example, because most of these are derived from organically derived raw materials, basically they're from plants that have died and decomposed and have gone through some sort of aging process. So there's going to be some inherent variability. And so it's always important that as you select these raw materials, you want to be able to find ones that meet your specifications and also can be found and sourced that are going to be reliably consistent over time. One last thing I want to mention about as far as physical properties, and it relates to water holding capacity, is that the height of your container greatly influences the water holding. So basically what happens is as you get a larger and taller container, that actually reduces the water holding capacity. So for example, a 14-inch patio container that's quite tall is going to have more airspace in that container than like a 288 cell plug tray would have, which is extremely short. The reason for this is because it's all about gravity and how gravity impacts the water that's being held in that column of substrate. And so that would be that the large container, that would be even the same mix. So if you had the same exact mix in the 288 cell plug tray versus the 14-inch patio container, really the differences in the container height and geometry is going to affect the relation or the ratio between water holding capacity and airspace. So keep that in mind, because a lot of growers will be using the same mix in cell packs as they would large patio containers. And do note that one mix may behave as a quote wet mix in a small container, whereas in a large container that same mix could be drier. And just want you to understand that that's really the effect of the container on the physical properties, not necessarily something being different about how the mix is being blended or the quality of raw materials that you're using. So some recommendations for physical properties. If you do tests with independent labs, they'll give you some data, which we'll dive into in a moment, helping you understand how to interpret some of these reports. In general, your physical property recommendations revolve around airspace, because airspace in the substrate tends to be the limiting factor in just about all substrates. And I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation that airspace is usually the limiting factor in physical properties, and airspace is highly correlated with root development. And so for these, I've got it broken down in this table into 3 different crop types. So young plants, so like seedlings or liners and propagation. Greenhouse finished crops, so most containerized crops that you would grow in the greenhouse, from a liner to finish, ready to ship, and then outdoor perennial nursery crops. So basically young plants 10 to 15%, greenhouse crops 15 to 25% airspace, and then perennial nursery crops, typically you want over 25% airspace. And the rationale for a lot of these is that in young plants, because of that small container size, you want as much airspace as possible. So in general, like if you can get a mix that has over 15% airspace, that's ideal. But because of how small those cells are, it would take an extremely coarse textured mix in order to achieve over 15% airspace. So we tend to be limited by the physical dimensions of the cell size in a young plant tray, which is why we have that 10 to 15% recommendation. But in general, you want as much airspace as possible because that helps with the propagation phase for young plants. In greenhouse crops, typically you want 15 to 25% airspace. That's more than adequate in greenhouse production. And then in outdoor perennial nursery crops, the reason why it's over 25% airspace is especially like if you're in an area like Florida or the Pacific Northwest where you can have very heavy rain events, you want to err more on the side of caution and have a little bit more drier mix for those regions, or just outdoor production in general, so that the mix is a little bit more forgiving in case you go through, because you have less control over watering because you're growing outdoors. I've already mentioned root zone oxygen is extremely critical to rooting, so that's just an important reminder. But you may be asking yourself, well, what about container capacity? What kind of recommendations are there? Well, because oxygen tends to be the limiting factor and not water holding capacity, there's usually not very clear water holding capacity recommendations for substrate. So in general, I typically recommend 60 to 65% container capacity or water holding capacity for most greenhouse crops. However, again, if you're growing a nursery type crop, you may want to be 50 to 55% container capacity. But it's important to note, how do your growers grow crops? So are they wet growers? Are they dry growers? So basically, optimizing the water holding capacity and the airspace for your staff is important. And then the other thing to keep in mind too is that when you go to sell these plants at the store, a lot of times you want to maximize your water holding capacity for shelf life because if you have a mix that has very little water holding capacity, well, it's not going to hold up at the store as well unless you have a store that does a really good job at watering plants and watering them frequently, which is typically the challenge. Is that when you get the plants to the store, you want them to go as long as possible so that there's not a lot of labor that's required in order to keep these plants alive. So long story short is it's really a balancing act between having the most airspace as possible for your growers to get nice, good, healthy roots. But on the other hand, you want to be able to have enough water holding capacity for when the plant does go to store so that it doesn't have to be watered super frequently. So, a couple different things I want to dive into as it relates to physical properties and Hydra Fiber. And, wood fiber in particular is a really popular raw material. It's really good at adding oxygen to the root zone. And so a lot of grower customers are looking at using this as a perlite replacement in the substrate because it pretty much does the same thing Perlite does at a one-to-one substitution in the mix. And so there's a lot of other products that are wood-based on the market, and I just want to highlight on this particular slide, this is looking at Hydra Fiber, which is on the left-hand side. This is a thermally fined, patented wood refining process, whereas this would be a competitive technology on the right-hand side. This is what is called atmospherically refined wood fiber. And the key difference is you can tell, like if you were not looking at these two samples under a microscope, you would see that these samples look fairly similar. But when you look at them under a microscope, you can see that there's a lot more surface area, a lot more finer fibers. And this is what helps Hydra Fiber have a very high total porosity. And this is what allows us in many instances to not really sacrifice water holding capacity when we add Hydra Fiber to the mix, while still maintaining a well-oxygenated root zone. However, on the example on the right, you're going to typically sacrifice water holding capacity for airspace. And so that's one of the key differences for Profile's Hydra Fiber refining technology. So let's look at some physical characteristics of just 100% Hydra Fiber. We have 5 different grades ranging from 065 to 510. This table is set up so that the finest fiber is on the left-hand side of the table, and we get progressively coarser as we move to the right-hand side of the table. As we discussed, total porosity being the total pores, whether they're water-filled or air-filled. All these grades of Hydra Fiber are all approaching 100% total porosity, which is unusual for many substrate raw materials. When we look at container capacity, again, this is the portion of water-filled pores of the total porosity. So we see that about 50% of the total porosity for 065, for example, is going to be water-filled pores. Whereas when we look at HF510 WB, we see that roughly about 30% of the total porosity is going to be water-filled pores. So again, this is 510 is going to have much less water holding capacity than 065 will. And then if we look at the air-filled porosity, again, about 40% or 45% of the air-filled porosity, which is the percentage of the total porosity, is going to have air. And when we look at, again, the coarser fibers, we see a lot more airspace in those fibers. So now let's look at how Hydra Fiber compares to like Perlite. I mentioned a few moments ago that most of our customers are looking to remove Perlite completely. It makes a pretty good substitution in the substrate. Well, let's look at, how do the physical properties of a typical horticultural grade Perlite compare to Hydra Fiber 160. And I'm using 160 here as an example because 160 is the grade of Hydra Fiber that most of our customers use starting out. So if we look at the total porosity, we can see a huge difference between the Perlite and the Hydra Fiber. So we see that the total porosity of Perlite is under 60%, whereas Hydra Fiber is almost, again, 100%. We're at 97.4% in this particular sample. Now, when we look at the water holding capacity, Perlite is only 22%, whereas Hydra Fiber has about double the container capacity of Perlite does, okay? So Perlite is being used in the substrate, again, as an aggregate to add air. So it again, no problem in this given context that it has such low water holding capacity. But again, it's very interesting to see that we have such high water holding capacity in the Hydra Fiber. And that's, again, directly related to the fact that we have very high total porosity. However, now what's really amazing to me is when we look at the airspace. So we see here with the horticultural grade Perlite, we have, again, a lot of airspace. That's what Perlite has historically been used for. Whereas Hydra Fiber has even more airspace. So not only does it have more water holding capacity, but it also has a lot more airspace than the Perlite does. And why is this? Well, the reason why, again, goes back to total porosity. So in the case of Perlite, we have a relatively low total porosity compared to Hydra Fiber 160. And so that allows us to, in many instances, not really sacrifice water holding capacity in the mix when we use Hydra Fiber in place of Perlite, and we still can have a better oxygenated root zone than Perlite. So now let's look at some blends. So I'm looking at some peat-based mixes. So most of our grower customers are typically using an 80% peat, 20% Perlite mix. And what they tend to transition to would be a 70% peat, 30% Hydra Fiber mix. We see of these two blends that they're both very similar total porosity. They're both in the upper 90s. We see in our container capacity that the peat-based mix has higher water holding capacity than the Hydra Fiber mix does. But we see here that the airspace in this particular example is greatly increased in the Hydra Fiber mix. So overall, between these two mixes, if a grower were to say, well, which mix is drier? Well, the fact that we have less water holding and we have more airspace, the Hydra Fiber mix would be drier in this particular example. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the peat percentages are different in these two mixes. But it's also important to note that different grades of peat and different quality of peat is going to give you different results. So you may find out that if you're using one vendor peat and you were to switch to another vendor peat, that could also vary your results as well. So it's important to note that your other raw materials that you're using in your mix is also going to have an impact on the physical properties. So let's look at some bark-based mixes. So here we're looking at equal portions of peat, bark, and Perlite. And all we're doing here is, again, we're keeping the ratios of peat and bark the same, and we're doing a 1-to-1 substitution for Perlite and Hydra Fiber in this example. So here we reduce the peat and increase the Hydra Fiber. But in this example, we're basically keeping the two mixes the same except for the Perlite to Hydra Fiber. We see here that we increase total porosity significantly in the mix with Hydra Fiber. We see here that we are actually able to increase the water holding capacity. So 3 percentage points, that may not seem like a lot, but that's that's a decent amount of water holding capacity. But look at this, the airspace, we're significantly increasing the airspace. Again, this all goes back to the total porosity of these raw materials. So because we have such high total porosity in Hydra Fiber, we're able to boost the overall total porosity of the substrate, and therefore not only just increase the airspace, but also increase the water holding capacity as well. And so, in this particular example, this grower would be able to improve their shelf life slightly by adding Hydra Fiber to the mix while still maintaining excellent and even better airspace than they had in their old substrate. So let's just review what we learned today. The first thing is the physical properties. We learned 4 different terms. bulk density, but as it relates to total porosity, airspace, and container capacity, these terms are often confused, and so just remember the simple equation of TP, or total porosity, which is all the pores in the substrate, equals airspace, which is the air-filled pores, plus container capacity, which is the water-filled pores. Airspace is the limiting factor in the substrate. So in general, you want anywhere from 10 to 25% airspace depending on the type of substrate, depending on the type of crop that you're growing. So if you're growing a young plants in propagation, you want 10 to 15% airspace. If you're growing finished greenhouse crops, you want 15 to 25% airspace. And if you're growing outdoor perennial or nursery crops, in general, you want greater than 25% airspace. And these recommendations, again, are all around the fact that oxygen tends to be the limiting factor in the container. So it's important to understand mixed components. So when you're designing your substrate, if you want to add more water holding capacity, it may be important to, let's say, go down to a finer grade of Hydra Fiber, or incorporate some core or vermiculite into your substrate. So all these different raw materials have impact on the final physical properties of your substrate. Roots love air. So in this particular example on the right-hand side, this is a chrysanthemum that's being grown in 80% Hydra Fiber. So this is a grower that really wanted to see how high they could go in Hydra Fiber, and they went up to 80%. And as you can see, the roots just absolutely love all the airspace that it has in this container. And again, Hydra Fiber is excellent for air. And also, it really helps make a very balanced and well-rounded mix because of the high total porosity. So we're able to, if you want to have a drier mix, we can shift the percentage of Hydra Fiber higher, or go to a higher, coarser grade of Hydra Fiber. But also, as we pointed out in the previous slide with the bark-based mix, if your goal is to improve air without sacrificing water holding capacity or shelf life, Hydra Fiber is the right solution for you. And with that, I thank you for your time today.